A global political and economic showdown is unfolding, one that pits the formidable former US President Donald Trump against Burkina Faso's resolute leader, President Ibrahim Traoré. This is not just a dispute over trade tariffs, it's a defining moment that signals a shift in global power dynamics. For decades, smaller nations like Burkina Faso have been overshadowed in the international arena, their economic futures vulnerable to policies crafted thousands of miles away. But now, under Traoré's leadership, Burkina Faso stands firm, challenging America's America First protectionist agenda and demanding fairness on the global stage. Can Burkina Faso and the broader African continent withstand the economic pressures exerted by the world's largest economy? Is President Ibrahim Traoré the courageous voice Africa needs to reclaim its economic destiny? And how will the United States respond to this unprecedented challenge? In early 2024, former President Donald Trump returned to the global stage with a powerful revival of his nationalist economic doctrine, America First. Central to this renewed agenda was an aggressive tariff policy, one that aimed to curb imports, protect American jobs, and reindustrialize the US economy. Under the new trade framework, steep tariffs were placed on a wide array of imported goods, especially raw materials and agricultural products from developing nations. Burkina Faso, a West African nation still rebuilding from decades of colonial extraction and modern-day economic dependency, found itself squarely in the crosshairs. Major exports like cotton, raw gold, shea butter, and processed agricultural goods faced severe trade restrictions in the US market. Suddenly, these products became too expensive and less attractive to American buyers. The immediate impact was devastating. Burkina Faso's export revenues plummeted. With reduced foreign earnings, government investments in infrastructure, education, and public health began to slow. The country's fragile growth was strangled by a policy it had no part in creating. Small farmers lost contracts. Local industries, unable to pivot quickly, began downsizing. The ripple effects touched every corner of Burkinabe society. For the United States, this may have been a calculated step toward economic resurgence. But for countries like Burkina Faso, it felt like economic warfare, a punishment for daring to compete in a global market long dominated by the industrialized North. Yet not everyone would accept this quietly. In the dusty corridors of Ouagadougou's government buildings, one voice grew louder, clearer, and more defiant. President Ibrahim Traoré was preparing to fight back not just for Burkina Faso, but for the dignity of all developing nations. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. While many in the global south might have resigned themselves to economic submission, Traoré did the opposite. He launched one of the most bold and comprehensive counteroffensives any African leader has taken in modern history against US trade dominance. His first move? Go global. Traoré took the battle straight to the highest international stages, the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. There, standing before delegates from across the world, he denounced the tariffs as modern colonialism in disguise, a tactic used by the powerful to cripple the emerging. His voice was calm, yet firm. His message was unmistakable. Africa will no longer accept economic enslavement masked as free trade. Next, he turned inward to defend the nation's economic lifelines. The Burkinabe government swiftly imposed a ban on high-tariff US imports such as industrial machinery, processed foods, and luxury consumer goods. But Traoré didn't stop at mere retaliation. He used the moment to ignite a wave of local production. Ministries coordinated with farmers, engineers, and manufacturers to replace imports with domestic alternatives. This wasn't just a trade war, it was a battle for economic sovereignty. Then came the masterstroke, the formation of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance, CESA, a regional trade bloc of African nations determined to resist Western economic pressure. Led by Traoré, CESA quickly gained support from Mali, Niger, Chad, and Guinea. Their mission? Create an internal market strong enough to resist external manipulation. It was the first time in decades that these countries spoke with a united voice on economics, security, and self-determination. And beyond Africa, Traoré looked to alternative powers: China, India, Brazil, and Russia. Through quiet diplomacy and rapid deal-making, Burkina Faso secured bilateral trade agreements that bypassed Western tariffs altogether. These new alliances offered development loans, technology partnerships, and infrastructure projects without the usual strings attached. At home, these moves transformed Ibrahim Traoré from a national reformer into a regional revolutionary. But the question remained, how would the West and, particularly Donald Trump, respond to this rising African resistance? Donald Trump didn't wait long to respond. In a televised address from Mar-a-Lago, the US president did what he does, bestit it hard and loud. He labeled Ibrahim Traoré as a radical destabilizer and warned that Burkina Faso was becoming a hub for anti-American aggression under the guise of economic nationalism. He accused Traoré of endangering global markets and undermining years of Western development aid in the Sahel region. Trump's words were echoed by a chorus of political commentators on major US networks. Headlines flashed across American media. Burkina Faso threatens global trade stability. Is Africa turning against the West? Traoré's rebellion, a new axis of resistance. The framing was deliberate. Traoré was not a reformer. He was a disruptor. Behind the scenes, Washington moved swiftly. Diplomats were deployed to African capitals, urging governments to distance themselves from the Sahel bloc. Economic aid packages were quietly reviewed and in some cases, delayed. Intelligence briefings began, including reports on Burkina Faso's alliances with China and Russia, hinting at potential security risks. But perhaps most telling was the shift in tone from American think tanks and trade lobbyists. Reports emerged recommending tighter restrictions on African imports, increased surveillance of anti-globalist governments, and new financial mechanisms to contain what they called the Traoré Doctrine. Traoré's moves had hit a nerve. He wasn't just resisting a tariff, he was challenging a global system built on Western dominance. And yet, for millions across Africa and the developing world, his stance was not reckless, it was righteous. Traoré had become something rare in modern geopolitics, a head of state willing to risk isolation to demand fairness. This clash between an aging empire and a rising rebellion was no longer just about economics. It had become a referendum on the future of global leadership. Inside Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré's bold stance against US tariffs didn't provoke fear, it sparked transformation. His government's decisive pivot toward economic self-reliance ignited a surge of civic pride not seen in decades. Across rural provinces and urban centers alike, people began to speak of l'indépendance réelle, true independence no just in name, but in practice. Local farmers, once dependent on foreign buyers, now received support from state-funded cooperatives to process and sell their goods domestically and within the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance. Corn, millet, cotton, and shea butter, once undervalued by international markets, became essential tools of national resistance. Farmers were no longer just producers, they were patriots. Traoré's administration ramped up domestic production incentives, offering tax breaks and subsidies to entrepreneurs investing in agriculture, manufacturing, and renewable energy. New training centers were opened in Ouagadougou, Bobo-Dioulasso, and Kaya, teaching export logistics, international trade law, and local value addition. Suddenly, exporting wasn't the job of a few elite, was becoming a national mission. Socially, his actions rekindled a sense of purpose in a population long disillusioned by foreign interference and economic hardship. University students marched in support of Traoré's decisions. Labor unions, typically skeptical of government policies, voiced approval as new jobs began to appear in manufacturing zones and agri-tech cooperatives. Even religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian, issued joint statements endorsing the nation's push for economic sovereignty. In sermons and prayer gatherings, the phrase "Burkina Faso will rise" echoed as both a blessing and a vow. But with this rising tide of national pride came mounting pressure, and Traoré knew that the path he had chosen would not come without risks, both from within and beyond. But no revolution is without resistance. As Burkina Faso surged forward with Traoré's radical reforms, fault lines began to emerge not just from outside powers, but from within the nation's own political establishment. Some high-ranking officials and former ministers, long entangled in foreign trade networks and aid agencies, began to question the wisdom of confronting a sitting US president. They warned of economic isolation, sanctions, and the freezing of international credit lines. Quiet opposition fermented in boardrooms and back channels, especially among those who once benefited from Western-aligned trade deals. Western embassies in Ouagadougou increased their visibility. Meetings behind closed doors with opposition figures became more frequent. Analysts within the government suspected intelligence activity aimed at identifying weaknesses in Traoré's coalition. Meanwhile, foreign-funded NGOs began issuing critical reports about authoritarianism and economic nationalism gone too far, attempting to reshape the narrative and erode popular support. At the same time, Traoré's government had to contend with real internal risks. Inflation ticked upward due to the initial disruption in imported goods. Certain industrial sectors struggled to meet local demand. Black market traders, often tied to regional smuggling networks, tried to exploit the instability. But perhaps the greatest threat wasn't economic, it was psychological. Western media narratives began portraying Burkina Faso as a rogue state, a narrative that sowed doubt among some urban elites and business owners. For Traoré, the battle for national sovereignty wasn't only being fought in factories or parliaments, it was being fought in people's minds. And yet, amidst the noise, the president's approval ratings soared. His speeches drew crowds. His insistence on dignity over dependency resonated not only with the working poor, but with the growing generation of young Burkinabé who had known only poverty and foreign control. In a world increasingly defined by economic coercion and digital propaganda, Ibrahim Traoré was redefining what it meant to lead in the global south. But this internal resilience would soon be tested by even greater forces beyond Africa's borders. In Washington, the lights of the Oval Office burned late into the night. President Donald Trump, now in his second term, under the revived slogan, "Keep America First," was not about to back down from a challenge by a small African nation. But this time, something was different. When Ibrahim Traoré took the floor at the United Nations General Assembly and denounced U.S. tariff policies by name, top officials in the White House and Pentagon saw it not just as political theater, but as the beginning of a new wave of resistance from the global south. And for Trump, that was unacceptable. The U.S. Treasury swiftly placed Burkina Faso under an economic watch list for disruptive trade practices. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, announced it was reviewing additional sanctions ranging from freezing the assets of Burkinabe government officials to suspending technology transfers, logistics support, and financial aid. A $120 million bilateral assistance package from USAID was indefinitely suspended. Trump, never one to waste a political opportunity, turned the crisis into a rallying point. Speaking at a campaign-style event in Iowa, he labeled Traoré a radical agitator dragging Africa into chaos, warning that the United States will not sit idly by while rogue states undermine the global trade order we built. Fox News and other right-leaning media outlets ran stories painting Burkina Faso as a reckless regime threatening American jobs and global stability. Traoré was portrayed as a dangerous populist, challenging the rules-based order that, in the eyes of Washington, needed to be neutralized. On the military front, the Pentagon expanded drone surveillance over the Sahel under AFRICOM, officially to monitor terrorist movements. Unofficially, they were watching Traoré. Any signs of foreign weapons, shipments, Russian mercenaries, or Chinese infrastructure projects were flagged. The Trump administration also pressured allies France, the UK, Germany, Canada to follow suit. A quiet but effective diplomatic freeze set in. Embassies scaled back operations in Ouagadougou. Western banks tightened financial controls, delaying or denying transfers in and out of the country. For Traoré, the squeeze was on. Yet even as Burkina Faso was increasingly isolated, Traoré stood firm. And in the shadows of Western condemnation, new allies were stepping forward. As Washington intensified its pressure campaign, something unexpected began to happen. Across the global south, from Latin America to Southeast Asia to the dusty borders of West Africa, ripple of resistance was forming. Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traoré, was no longer standing alone. In South America, Brazilian President Ricardo Monteiro, known for his left nationalist rhetoric, publicly declared his support for Burkina Faso's right to economic self-determination. "We know what it's like to be punished for wanting sovereignty," he said during a speech in Brasilia. Trade delegations were quickly dispatched to Ouagadougou, with discussions ranging from agricultural exchange to energy cooperation. In Asia, India expanded bilateral ties, offering technology assistance for Burkina's agriculture and fintech sectors. Meanwhile, Chinese media outlets began portraying Traoré as a symbol of the new African dignity, framing his defiance of Trump's tariffs as part of a broader decolonial movement. In Russia, state-owned energy companies signed long-term deals with Burkina Faso for mining operations and infrastructure support, bypassing US-dominated financial systems. Russian military advisors also quietly began assisting with border defense and cybersecurity. And then came the real shock. The African Union held an emergency summit in Addis Ababa. For the first time in recent memory, the continent was united behind one voice. The summit produced a sharp communiqué condemning unilateral economic aggression and endorsed the creation of a Pan-African Economic Defense Fund to shield countries from foreign financial blackmail. Even in Europe, cracks began to show. Youth-led climate and decolonial movements in France and Belgium staged protests in solidarity with Burkina Faso. Hashtags like #StandWithBurkina and #Traoré is right began trending across activist circles. In response to the global momentum, Traoré called a special session of the Sahel Economic Sovereignty Alliance, CESA. 10 nations joined a pact to reduce dollar dependency, boost intra-African trade, and accelerate local industrialization. They even proposed a digital currency, provisionally called AfriCoin, to bypass SWIFT and IMF-backed credit systems. What began as a local reaction to punitive US tariffs had now snowballed into something far bigger, a coordinated challenge to the global economic order, a turning of the tide in the long war over who controls development. For the first time in decades, a sitting African president had not only said no to Washington, but had inspired a new generation of nations to rethink the very terms of their engagement with the West. The old tool sanctions, pressure, isolation were losing their power. And in this emerging era of multipolar defiance, the next battleground would not be fought only in speeches or trade deals. It would be ideological. It would be moral. It would be generational. In a world where superpowers have long dictated the rules of the game, Burkina Faso, a small nation in the heart of the Sahel, has become a symbol of defiance. Not with weapons, not with vast foreign reserves, but with something far more daunting to the old powers, an unyielding will. President Donald Trump may believe his tariff policies will force poorer nations to bend the knee. But he did not anticipate the rise of a young leader who could not be bought, who would not be afraid, who refused to depend Ibrahim Traoré. Traoré did not merely react to injustice. He built a clear strategy of confrontation, calling for regional unity, leveraging technology, launching a global media campaign, and igniting the spirit of self-reliance. More importantly, he made the world ask a question it had never asked loudly enough. Why must small nations endure an economic model imposed by the powerful? And what happens when they dare to push back? We are witnessing something rare, a global power shift, not waged with guns, but with courage. Burkina Faso has chosen the hard path. Yet it is this path that inspires millions from Lagos to Lima, from Jakarta to Johannesburg to stand up and reclaim control of their economic destinies. If you believe the world is ready for a new order, where the voices of small countries carry weight, where fairness is not a privilege but a right, please share this story. Let Burkina Faso's voice be heard far and wide. And never underestimate the power of a small nation when led by a leader who refuses to bow. Let us begin with a heartfelt prayer for Africa, a continent rich in history, culture, and resilience. We pray for peace, to blanket the vast landscapes of Burkina Faso and every nation striving for dignity and self-determination. May the people of Burkina Faso find strength amid hardship, courage in the face of adversity, and hope that never fades. We ask for divine guidance for President Ibrahim Traoré, a leader who carries the weight of a nation's dreams on his shoulders. May his decisions be wise, his spirit unbreakable, and his vision clear as he leads Burkina Faso toward economic sovereignty and true freedom. In this critical moment, may Africa rise not only with the power of its resources, but with the strength of its people united. To you, our viewers, we say, this is more than a story. It is a call to witness history in the making. If you believe in the awakening of Africa, if you believe in leaders who stand for justice, and if you want to be part of a community that seeks truth beyond the headlines, we invite you to join us. Please subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you become part of a movement that refuses to turn away from the struggles and victories of a continent awakening from centuries of silence. Your subscription is not just a click, it is a commitment to awareness, solidarity, and hope. Together, let us watch closely, listen deeply, and support boldly. Because when Africa rises, the world changes.